Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Way of the Showman, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship. I am Captain Frodo, and I will be your gracious host and guide along the way. It is great to be back. I look forward to these meetings every time we have them. It's an enriching experience for me. Of course, I'm not talking to you directly in the flesh, but I always have you in mind. And I am having several projects running alongside each other, where I'm working with different artists on many different types of skills. Some I'm working with, we're working just on an act, improving that, or some we're working on creating something so it works for television. Some are extended long processes where I have worked with someone to create a full entire show, and some I help do actual writing texts that, and in all of this I'm then shaping the material, and I keep this process that we have going on here on this podcast always in mind, because this process that we're going through here together now, it's me trying to lay out all these ideas and influences to share with you the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings of what I do. But at the same time as I'm doing all of this, working with many different artists, it feels like this is helping me, what would you say, shape these ideas into practical tools. I've already been doing this kind of work for years, and in a way the work that I'm sharing with you in these ideas and the concepts are coming out of me having to do work. So it's like you do the work first, and then I try to put into words why is it that I make these choices, and what is it that I think about when I think about shows and showmanship. And now I'm really feeling like I'm making major leaps forward, and the work that we are creating is very good. Like, there's very interesting things coming out of these collaborations. So to all those of you who have contacted me to have these online sessions where we jam together, it is such a pleasure to be working with you, and you are always on my mind, and all those others out there who are not directly working with a project with me. Every now and I get these little some of you actually have dropped me some coffee money at buymeacoffee.com/Captain Frodo, and that's of course very nice, but also the messages that I get from you about how certain aspects of whatever it is that I go on about, how that has increased your given you some inspiration. Thanks to all of you. And I am now feeling like I'm getting to, even though last week was maybe one more deep dive into something that people felt like, oh, this is a little abstract again. And I'm talking, of course, about how showmanship is a process and not a thing. It's more like a fire than a rock. And that's what we talked about last time. And always I kind of feel like if we want, like, presenting our material, if we talked about how a show is a character presenting material in some sort of structure, whatever it is we're doing with our art, whatever it is that we're presenting, it's kind of the problem that we're trying to solve here is how to present it. But to understand and discover a solution to any problem, we need to understand what the problem is, and to understand that problem we need to know what it is that we're actually talking about. What is this thing? And I have perhaps, in all these explorations that we have together, I have perhaps dived deeper than what's necessary, or that most people find interesting. But that is the nature of how my mind works, and I like to, if not stand on solid ground, because we looked at it last time, and it might be that this flowing foundation of showmanship as a process actually in one way feels like, oh, then we can't pin anything down when it's just moving. But even within chaos, in chaos theory, there are these things called strange attractors. There are stuff in there that we still can use, not as solid bedrock, but that by understanding the process, then we can learn a lot about where we can then build our house. So, in a sense, we are all building our houses on the continents, and the continents are actually not fully still. They're moving and stretching. Some of those who live in LA or in Australia too. Not only does Melbourne have like a full lockdown, there must be more than 80 days, and they're about to come out of it now. They just did last week, which must have been a glorious celebration. Man, more than 80 days at this late stage in the pandemic, when Norway is all free and ready to go, and that they are just coming out of that. I bow my head down in respect, and I hope that you can get back on track real quick. But anyway, I totally lost my train of thought there. It was about building our house on solid foundations, because while they were then in lockdown for 70th day or whatever, then they had an earthquake, like 5 point something on the Richter scale earthquake. So we are all living on shaky ground. So even though we are living on fluid foundations, that everything is a process, and certainly showmanship and a show and all of this is a process. This is like the liquid lava that lies there. Deep beneath it is the solid core of the earth, and on top we're floating on the continents, but that's solid enough, and that's where we're sort of going to be taking it off from today. So I think it almost sums it up. I have talked about this in the first season, and I talked about it again last season, that everything that we care about most in the world are not things. They are processes, like our relationships, like a human being, like life itself is a state of being outside of equilibrium, where only when we're dead and everything rots apart, then are we going towards some sort of stable equilibrium. Before that, we're all in a process, pouring food and energy in and staying alive. So everything is a process and not a thing. And so we're trying to understand what this thing is, and we're going to build further on it today. So, of course, I just said before this time, just to break it up, if you do like what we do here, then please call a friend. This is your chance to call a friend and say, hey, are you a follower of the way? Check this out. This is something weird going on here. If you like to go deep, take a trip down the way of the showman with the captain and with the entire crew, which is in this case would be all of you beautiful listeners. All right, let's step into the next exploration of what showmanship is. All right, understanding showmanship, or what showmanship is. Part 2, perhaps. Now, if we accept that a show is made up of character presenting material in some sort of structure, then it would, of course, be possible to create a show where no consideration is given to the audience. We could base every decision only on what we ourselves would like to do, never considering whether this would be interesting or fun for others who might see it. For instance, certain artists create work which is of great interest to other artists. They become a performer's performer, often because the concepts they're working with, or the rules that they're breaking, places them in a place where the audience are, in a sense, left behind. Maybe you need some specialized knowledge to really appreciate them. Maybe the skills are exceptionally hard, but you can't quite appreciate the difference unless you have a certain understanding of the skills presented. Or maybe their approach is just too novel. We love novelty in our acts and in our entertainment, but not too much. We can handle something being a bit out there. But if it's all the way out on a way out of the maps, somewhere onto the white pages at the back of the atlas, then it leaves most people cold. They need to be able to come with you. If the character is unlikable and the material boring and repetitive and there is no seeming structure to it, it's quite likely that people will dislike it. I just finished listening to the autobiography of Philip Glass, and he was talking about this. His music is repetitive, and people would find that kind of boring, and they just all of a sudden the song would end or whatever, and they would have seen no structure in it. But as he went on, he has more and more found an audience for it, and maybe the character is more likable. I don't know what has happened there. Don't want to draw that analogy too much, but if you are going out into completely new territory, you might have to kind of create the map and stake it out, and then people will eventually go, oh wow, this is the territory where this person works, and this is how it's supposed to be, and then you can start to enjoy it because of that. But us being showfolk and entertainers, we don't always get to push our art quite that far. Now, a core part of my process and what the Way of the Showman is about is to always keep the audience in mind. And we will delve a lot deeper into this in the following explorations. And I just wanted to point out that a show could be created in a solipsistic vacuum, where the only criteria for each choice in creating and structuring your material is or was that you liked it. And this was kind of brought to mind by having a conversation with my friend Jay Gilligan, an extraordinary juggler and artist, who uses the following kind of exercise when teaching his juggling students if they ever get stuck and says, I don't know how to make a routine. And he calls it his yes-no sequence. And it's pretty simple. It's like, do something is point 1. Point 2, ask yourself if you like what you did. And the answer will be yes or no. And if yes, repeat it and add on the next step of the sequence. And if no, then make something new until that answer is yes. And the key here is that you're not allowed to answer maybe or whether or not you liked it. You can't say, I liked it maybe. Either you like it or you don't, and that moves you on. And this means that you will then end up with a sequence where you are happy with each individual part or bit, or the sequence, and the sum of all these choices, they adds up to your act. And this could be the last thing that you do in your creative project. This could be used to create a whole show as well. And then you could show it and not have another perspective enter into it. That would also be a type of show creation. Now, if this was the case, then you could certainly have a character presenting material in a structured way. We can make endless choices and have endless reasons for the choices we make in any given creative process creating a show. But when we add the dimension of showmanship, it's all about the experience of the audience as they watch the show. This is a difference between a show and showmanship. Showmanship is all about the audience. So in that sense, showmanship can be seen as another level to add onto or on top of a show. It can also, of course, be woven into the creation of it, but it can also be just a separate level. You then make it first, and then you consider it. It is not about what is presented. Showmanship is not about what is being presented, but how it's presented in relation to the audience. This is something we looked at in the last episode when we looked at some of those definitions. So, in the last episode, we talked about how showmanship is a process, and we managed to narrow starting a fire down to 2 elements, namely fuel and something to raise the temperature of the fuel enough to ignite it, like a match. And fuel would be, some logs or whatever. And once the match has lit the fuel, the process produces heat and light. And from the explicit point of view of a human being making a fire outside their caravan, the light and the heat is the purpose of the fire. And the fire does not have any purpose in itself, but it has a clear purpose, or indeed many purposes, for us human beings. So that's what we talked about last time, and if we can oversimplify a fire into 2 essential elements that fuses into a hot happening process, what can we find if we attempt that same stripping down with showmanship? what's the essential elements in the process of showmanship. And here again, we're making a map. And before we start whittling away at showmanship to see what we find at its core, and not the core that might be that it's a process, this is what's just above the flowing foundations of showmanship as a process. And before we go into that, I'd just like to point out again that any system, theory or model is always wrong. Any model is too simple. By definition, the map is not the territory. A map is not the world. A map or a model is always a reduction or a synthesis of what it represents. But it is the exact simplification which makes it useful. If the map was as detailed as the territory, it would have to be the territory, which would make it inconvenient as a tool. If the match was perfect, 1-to-1, the map would no longer fit in your pockets, since it would be actual mountains, streams, and churches. A map is but a tool, and only as good as the person using it. So, what we are setting out on is to create a map. And this map is of the 4 elements of showmanship, as I see it. Now, let me forewarn you. As I reveal the essentials of showmanship, you will not have some great epiphany. I'm not trying to blow anyone's mind with some incredible revelation. The aim is much more along the lines of pointing out what is so blatantly obvious that we might have forgotten it or even failed to notice it. So the essential components, the starting 2 components as I see it, is the showman and the audience. Showman, audience. And there you go. It's as simple as that. And this is then already separating it out from what the show is, because here it's like showmanship is about a showman standing in front of a group of people, or even on 1-to-1. There you go. It's as simple as that. But from these 2 very simple things, I have discovered much great philosophy, much great thought. And as soon as there is 2, there is always the possibility for dialogue. When 2 meet, dialogue happens in one way or another. When there is 2, in that regards, when there is 2, there is also one more, the meeting of the 2. So when there is 2, there is 3. As simple as this might seem, my journey to arrive at these 2 constituents was very long. This starting point, which led me to the next 2 essential components, was always there, so easy to see that I missed it. The showman and the audience are, to follow along the fire analogy, like the igniter and the fuel, like the match and the kindling or logs. And without the coming together of these 2 poles, there is no dynamic field where something more can emerge. Without both these elements present, the process of showmanship does not make sense. It can't happen. Without either of the 2, there is no showmanship. Then it is something different. It might still be closely related, but it's not the full expression of the process. Without the showman to show something and an audience to behold it, there is no show. And from this last little comment there, without the showman to show something and an audience to behold it, there is no show. From this I have then snuck in and named the next component. Namely the dialogic interaction between showman and audience. And that is the show, which is the meeting of the showman and the audience. This is the phenomenon of shows. So it's that space in between there. And then I've sort of created this stuff. I've created these kind of mathematical looking formulations of what showmanship is. And this is because I enjoy these kinds of things. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but if I wanted to write this in a mathematical looking formula to make it seem more important and scientific, it could be something like this, like showman plus audience equals show. And from that we then get that showman plus no audience does not equal a show. That's a somewhat ridiculous attempt at making sure this thing is understood, and that a showman without an audience is not equal to a show, and a showman alone does not a show make. And there will of course always be edge cases, things that might or might not be a show. And one case might be art by instruction, which is somewhat famously done by Yoko Ono in her piece 22 Instructions for Paintings, where she challenges her viewers or audiences to make the work in their mind or at home or wherever else you might feel like making it, where she gives instruction, do this, do that. But to understand showmanship in the way it's presented in the many myriads of venues and situations that I perform in, where only rarely I have access or control over aspects such as lights and sound, background, setting, and even exactly where the audience is seated, the concept of showman interacting with an audience and this interaction being called a show makes for me excellent sense as a map. By understanding this, as we will when we continue to explore this, we shall also understand and be able to name and better understand complex conceptual art and other works of performance art, such as the art by instruction by Yoko Ono. It's like, is this art, is it not? Maybe we still won't know the answer, but at least we will have some parameters to answer it or to grapple with it. But is that all there is to showmanship? Let's going back to the fire analogy. A showman without an audience is like matches before they're struck. He is fire in potential, or more apt, a showman is show in potential. He is a spark awaiting the right conditions, i.e. getting together with neatly structured and stacked kindling and logs. A showman without an audience, even if he is running through his carefully structured material, is not doing a show. We call this rehearsal, and it is different from a show. If done for its own sake, I guess we could call the process pretending or playing. Children play shows all the time, at least in my household. A show without an audience is like lighting a match without igniting anything, a short flare in the dark. Similarly, an audience in a field gathered without a showman or performer as their focus of attention is not really an audience. It's rather a group of people. People gathered in a field or on a beach aren't an audience. They're gathered for other activities like picnicking, protesting, or maybe waiting for a train. So this leaves me to this something more. And this all hopefully leaves us pretty clear that showman and audience are essential constituents in the process of showmanship. And from their coming together arises something more. And in the process of the fire there's the light and heat, and when the showman and the audience meet, it produces a show. This is the third constituent. The show is a meeting point. It's the result of a participatory experience between the audience and the showman. The show is the conversation that happens when showman and audience interacts. The show is not just what the showman has to present for the audience, although that is an important part of the show. It is not all a show is. The audience wants their showman to have something to show, or else they'll rapidly lose interest and disperse. But there's more to it than what the showman offers in form of structured material. There's the audience, but there's something more still. It's the glue that holds it all together. So yeah, it's not just about the performer, and it's not just about the showman. It's about the glue that holds it all together. And we find a clue to this other element in that Macmillan dictionary definition of showmanship that we looked at last time, that showmanship is the ability to do things in a lively and enthusiastic way that attracts attention. I guess we also find clues in the manifesto, the Illuminated Showman's Manifesto, where we're told that the showman cries for attention and has something to show when he gets it. The definition from Macmillan uses the word attention, and that is also what's cried for in the manifesto. Attention is the next and final element. This is the fourth component. The fourth component of attention creates the foundation for the meeting space, the place between, the interesting place for shows to emerge. Interesting, interest, the space between, which is already what we say, the place between, the interesting place, the place between, the midway. This is where the shows emerge. So, what is attention? And we know what attention is, but when we're asked, we don't. According to Wikipedia, attention is the behavioral and cognitive process of selectively concentrating on a discrete aspect of information, whether considered subjective or objective, while ignoring other perceivable information. So it's kind of this spotlight where we focus in on things. Attention is what allows us to focus on a bird jumping around on the ground, and also what we use to separate that bird out from the background, if it's sitting still on a nest, for instance, camouflaged. The bird, too, is a master of shifting attention. It uses one type of attention when it's looking for and picking up food in the dirt, and another kind of attention to scan the area to keep a lookout for any potential threats. For ourselves, looking at the bird, we have no problem focusing and paying attention to it, in different ways. We can easily shift and point our spotlight of attention around to the ground the bird is jumping on, the tree next to it, or the smell of wet autumn leaves, or the bird as it flies away, and the movement takes our attention back to it. We can also, with ease, shine that unique spotlight inside ourselves. We can pay attention to how we feel. We can pay close attention to our breath, and we can pay attention to a string of thoughts, or how we feel about those thoughts. We all have some folk psychological understanding of what attention is, yet it is a very complex phenomenon. We pay attention to things we like, and we can lose concentration. Certain things demand our attention, like if you accidentally put your hand on a hot stove. Then there's the kind of attention that's necessary to make a show happen, and this is a shared kind of attention. It's an attention which goes both ways. Showman and audience are both playing a vital interactive part in this process. The audience pays attention to the showman, and the showman pays attention to the audience. In this dialogic space, powered by shared attention, shows can happen. The showman has created his material and structured it with this exact shared attention in mind. This shared attention is mutually beneficial. The showman gets his purpose from the audience wanting to take part in what he has to show, and the audience is enriched and has their investment of time and attention refined by engaging with the showman. In this dialogic space of shared attention, we not only get performance and shows, we get all art. This space is where we get learning, we get the human ability of being able to present something to others, to explain, illuminate, or connect things otherwise hard to grasp. Or it's also the space where we share skills and knowledge of any kind. It is the foundation for the rapid skill sharing, which is an astounding feature shared by all members of the human species. In other words, it is the space which happens between a human and any other phenomenon or thing you intentionally or intentionally encounter and engage with. This is where all kinds of communications happen. And I'm saying that it's also between things. It's between people, of course, but it's also between things, between a person that looks at a painting and following, like you're looking at a painting and there is now a kind of dialogue. I look at the neatly painted squares and lines and I'm going, yeah, this is somehow making me feel this way, and that's that process. What Gadamer calls art. This is the process of art that happens in this dialogue. This is that space of shared attention. Now, of course, the painting isn't paying attention to you, but through the artist painting it, you're kind of having the dialogue with the product of the artist. So that's why it's a little bit different with the painting as opposed to with directly engaging with somebody in a show. But anyway, following this logic, we could also say that a Paleolithic woman in a cave in the south of France 30,000 years ago, teaching her son how to make fire, she is doing a kind of show. She was showing. These are the kind of implications I see as I journey along the way of the showman and lift my head towards the horizon. So, to summarize, in my pretend mathematical formula, expanded and completed with the inclusion of attention, we get showman plus attention plus audience equals show. So these are the 4 elements of showmanship: showman, audience, attention, and when these come together, we, in the process of showing, we get the show. So this is then, of course, as we spoke about before, it's very simple, but it's also very powerful. It's a map. It's not the territory, it's a simplification. But from this point of view, I see bigger and more complex patterns more clearly. So, let's look at to build a fire and life and death. So in lieu of what we've learnt, let us take one more look at this fire, looking at fire alongside showmanship. We simplified fire to an igniter and fuel, and these 2 elements fuse in the flaming process, which produces heat and light. In showmanship, the fuel finds its analog in the audience and the showman in the igniter. The heat and light is then like the show. We've found a 4th essential in showmanship, and I'd like to see what the role of shared attention would look like, or if it can be found in the fire analogy. Because a good analogy goes both ways. We should be able to learn about showmanship by looking at a fire, and vice versa, learning about a fire by looking at showmanship. So novel learning and creative thinking can actually always be sort of gained from changing this perspective, or these novel combinations, like, if this is true, then is this true? What if I take the phone and do it inside a car? That's something new. A mobile phone. Anyway, so I'd like to get at this along the literary scenic route. All this talk of fire makes me, I like the work of Jack London, the author, and it makes me think of Jack London's seminal short story, To Build a Fire. I won't go into too much detail about the story, apart from it being about a man in the Yukon area in very cold conditions, who experiences how being able to build a fire under extreme conditions is the difference between life and death. Now, if you haven't read it, do. It's a good one. And while you're at it, this is a good exercise that I do a lot of the time whenever I am interacting with any kind of medium, whether I'm reading a story, or whether I'm watching a movie, or whether I'm reading a book about the structures of the brain, whatever it is that I'm currently reading, an individual history of the individual, in the cultural history of the individual, whatever that is that I'm reading, I try to read this through the metaphorical lens of showmanship. I look at it as reading this story, and this is the exercise for you to do. Read the story, or find that there's several recorded versions of it on YouTube, if you want to have it read for you while you're out doing whatever business you do. But read the story, or listen to it through a metaphorical lens of life and death, as it is for the showman trying to make a show happen under difficult circumstances. The story is about a man who tries to build a fire. But if you see this as a picture of a showman trying to make a show happen under difficult circumstances, interesting imagery and interesting connections will appear for you. Now, the essentials of a fire is a match igniting fuel, but there are a few other conditions that needs to be met for a fire to properly take hold or catch at all. We find the hint of it in the name of the story. You need to build it. How to build a fire. The right conditions for making a fire are, for a starter, that the sticks, logs and kindling, they must be dry. They also need to be stacked and organized in a certain way to catch properly. If you place the logs on the bottom and the dry kindling and the twigs on top, chances are that the kindling will burn up bright and fast and not ignite the logs. The structure of a successful fire is important. A fire can start in practically any which way. It can be raining and no matches needs be present, but this is dependent on a randomness which isn't safe to gamble on. If you're camping and want to heat a can of beans along your way, don't rely on the appearance of a spontaneous combustion nearby. I learned that the hard way. In London's story, it is real life and death. If it lights, he lives. If not, not. The protagonist must be able to reliably make a fire at any time. And a showman too must be able to reliably make a show happen at any given time in any given place, regardless of the circumstances. This is a matter of life and death on stage for him. It's not a coincidence that when a performer fails on stage, we call it to die. To die on stage is part of every performer's education. Performing is a life and death situation for the showman. With the pandemic shutting down the stages of the world, people like me were cut off from performing. And people like yourself too, no doubt. It is hard to convey how damaging this was to performers. As artists, our whole identity is tied up with what we do. The skills I have and the acts I perform, my shows, this is not just what I do. It's who I am. It's who we are. We can't do shows. When we can't do shows, it's not just stopping me from going to work. It stops me being who I am. The part of my identity that gives meaning to everything else is gone. If you lose your purpose and your meaning of life, you are in a very real life and death situation. I needed to make a fire. I took each chance I had to make new material, rehearse and practice to the max. I wrung all I could from the occasion, even if all that occasion was a show for my daughter's carnival at school. I needed to get the most out of the rare opportunity to remember who I was. And if the showman at the market square from the manifesto fails to capture the random people moving through the square, fails to catch and hold their attention, it's like his match flared up and failed to get the fire going. Even if a few people stop and watch for a while, but then lose interest and walk off, the show has failed. The fire dies, and with it dies the showman. Like for the unnamed protagonist of To Build a Fire, when the fire goes out, when the show fails, hypothermia, danger, and death looms. This is the existential situation for performers during the COVID pandemic. We are lost not just in the wilderness of the world, but we've lost the anchoring on who we are in our inner world as well. The showmanship is adrift. The shared attention is the right conditions for a show. The right conditions for a fire is dry and structured, just right kindling at the bottom, then sticks, then logs, stacked in a way that ensures enough oxygen enters. So building a fire is an art. And that shared attention and the show and the audience and all this all finds its not direct translations or direct analogues, but I think that shared attention is probably the right conditions. So, with that, I think we have hit all the different points that we needed to talk about in relation to these four essentials of showmanship: the showman, the audience, the shared attention, and the emergence of the show. Next week, we will be looking in a very nerdy and a very fun exploration as we look at the geometry of showmanship and how beautifully that all can paint a picture of the process of showmanship. Yes, so this will be exciting times for the nerds and lovers of geometry coming up. So It's not so often that I reveal what I'm going to be talking about next time, but this time I'm finding this was the chapter that I thought, maybe this will not be useful to include in the podcast at all. But then when I went through it again, I go, well, I'm kind of struck by how peculiar it all sort of continues to fit with the model that we've created. So yeah, that'll be fun. Let's see what happens. And that is, now that I've already said that you can support me, I said that in the beginning, you can support me on buymeacoffee.com/CaptainFrodo. Drop me some money if you want to. If not, you can contact me if you're working on some project where you think I could be of benefit, or just having a conversation about the general state of life. That's all possible. You can find me on Frodo Santini on Facebook, or on Captain Frody, or Captain Frodo, as I sometimes call it, on Facebook. I think I'm on Frodo Santini on Instagram too, even though I don't quite know how that works. But yeah, again, please tell a friend. That's how we can spread these ideas further than I can. Yes. With that said, I have said all that I need to say for this week. And all that's left to be said is take care of yourself and those you love. And I hope to see you along the way.